Well, welcome, friends. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today about wetlands. We'll be just brushing the surface of wetlands. I teach a quarter-long course in wetland science and ecology, and um, we only have just a few minutes to talk about wetlands. So we'll just hit on some major concepts to orient you about the exciting world of wetlands. In particular, we'll focus on a few things that are critical. First is a wetland definition that's used widely in the United States and related concepts. We'll talk about how wetlands are identified. And there are three important criteria that are used in wetland identification. That's wetland hydrology, wetland vegetation, and wetland soil. We'll just touch briefly on each of those criteria. And then we'll get into a brief discussion of wetland functions and values, what those are. And that all points to why wetlands are important for humans and other organisms on this earth. And then finally, we'll wrap up with just a very brief overview of wetland regulation. So let's start out with a definition right off the bat so we all know what we're talking about. In fact, for many decades, people really didn't know or agree on what wetlands were. There were many definitions out there, but over the last 3 or 4 decades, there's been a general consensus that wetlands are basically this definition. And I'll just read it for you here slowly. It's somewhat straightforward, but a little complex once you start digging into it. Areas that are inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support, and that under normal circumstances do support, a prevalence of vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. Wetlands generally include swamps, marshes, bogs, and similar areas. So if you begin dissecting this definition, you'll notice that there are those three important criteria that are included. Water needs to be present, vegetation adapted for life in saturated soils. So those are the three criteria that focus on identifying wetlands in the field. This definition actually comes from the Clean Water Act from 1972. But it took a while for that definition to be widely consensus in the United States. We'll talk a little more about that later in my talk. So the Clean Water Act is a federal statute first passed by Congress in 1972. That's when President Nixon was president, you might recall, those old timers of you out there. President Nixon really did not like the Clean Water Act. He liked the Clean Air Act, which was passed at the same time, but he really didn't like the Clean Water Act. And so he vetoed that statute as it crossed his desk. But then Congress overrode his veto. And then just to spite Congress, basically, for overriding his veto, he absconded with the funding for the Clean Water Act initially. So sort of a vengeful guy, but we're back in play here with the Clean Water Act after he left office. And now the Clean Water Act, as I'll point out later in my talk, is among the most important regulations that this country uses to protect and manage wetlands. So until about the 1970s, there was a widespread misconception about what wetlands are. In fact, that misconception was deeply rooted in people's brains and still persists. I, as an instructor, encounter this perception frequently among my students and among people that listen to my talks. The concept is referred to as terrestrialization. And what that refers to is wetlands being considered transitional between say a lake and an upland forest. So we're talking about successional processes where a pond initially filled with water or a lake filled with water gradually fills with plant debris to a point where it at some time in the future no longer is a wetland. And I'll just point out this image here up on the right This is from a textbook, actually, 2003, which conveys this concept. Sedges and floating plants close over the open water, trapping sediments in their roots and gradually drying out the pond, referred to as terrestrialization. This is an interesting misconception because there's just abundant evidence out there that once a wetland is a wetland, it will essentially always be a wetland until something dramatic happens, such as the source of water that supports that wetland is eliminated, or the wetland is filled, say by a land slope failure or human activity. And we can point to many examples in this state, just in our own backyards, of wetlands that have been in existence just literally for hundreds of thousands of years. For example, on the Olympic coastal plain, there are wetland systems, including bogs and fens, which were not glaciated during the last ice age. And thus, there's evidence there that these have persisted on the landscape for on the scale of hundreds of thousands of years. So this concept of terrestrialization is a misconception and should be deleted from our brains. Here's a great example of a wetland in King County, and a previously glaciated part of King County. This is a bog, basically has been around since the continental ice sheet left the Puget Sound region. It's sphagnum bog, has sphagnum and sedge deposits that are about 25 feet deep. It's now forested with hemlock and western red cedar, and it has been a wetland or an open water body since the ice left, and will continue to be a wetland well into the future. So that concept of terrestrialization being stated as a misconcept, we need to talk about really what wetlands are. And so scientists and others now recognize that wetlands are distinct ecosystems. They're intimately connected with, but distinct from, deep water aquatic and terrestrial or upland systems. So it's this really interesting area between those ecosystems that are upland or relatively dry in nature, and those ecosystems that are perpetually inundated, flooded with water, ponds, lakes, that kind of thing. And so this concept of wetlands, an interesting concept for somebody who spends a lot of time in doing wetland regulation, and that you're trying to basically identify a resource that exists on a transition, a continuum, if you will. And that continuum is constantly shifting through time as environmental conditions change. Say climate change affects where water is going, how long it resides, and so forth. One of the important things that wetland science practitioners do is identify wetlands on the landscape. And so we attempt to delineate those wetland resources using a methodology that I'll refer to later. But it's somewhat artificial in that these resources are on this continuum between upland terrestrial systems and deep water aquatic systems. And so this is where the magic happens in wetland science. It's this really interesting interaction between hydrology, the presence of water, plants and animals that are adapted to living in water for most of their life cycle, and the soils and the chemistry that is present where you have water abundantly on a landscape. So it's this interaction between the life, the soils, and the water, which makes wetland science really interesting in many different ways, and also makes them very important from a functional perspective. You know, the concept of wetlands really hasn't been viewed favorably in human history until actually very recently. So from the 1500s to the late 1960s, wetlands really were considered bug-infested, disease-ridden wastelands that impeded settlement and economic development. And that led to dramatic wetland habitat loss and perturbation of wetland biological, chemical, and physical processes. And so you're all familiar with how wetlands often are depicted in media and in entertainment. and in stories. Here's a couple of illustrations that illustrate that concept. The movie Frogs there on the right, that's actually a pretty good film, in my opinion. 1972, perhaps some of you have seen it. There's Joan Van Ark being consumed by the wetland. Her family was not nice to nature, and so the animals that lived in a nearby wetland began to take their revenge on her family members. So if you're into that kind of a horror film, you might check out Frogs. Pretty interesting film. The main activities that humans have had that have resulted in wetland perturbation, disturbance, and loss have been largely agricultural. Here, for example, is a 1915 illustration of a wetland that is being ditched, tiled for drainage purposes, so that this wetland can be converted to agricultural uses. You know, wetlands were among the first environments that humans would change because often you would have abundance of water, great for growing crops, excellent soils, often fertile, again, great for crops. And they were generally flat. Sometimes they didn't even need to be cleared because they didn't have trees or shrubs. And so they were really easy places to go to begin agricultural practices. The tiles that they would use are illustrated in the upper right image. These days, this whole process is mechanized, as illustrated in this photo in the lower right. And we use plastic perforated pipe now to do that drainage. And if you look at the impact of agriculture on wetlands, one of the most interesting areas of the country to study this is in the upper Midwest, places like Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. And you look at the amount of cropland, current cropland that is tiled, meaning that it needed to be drained. The percentages are large. So Iowa, 25%, Illinois, 35%, Indiana and Ohio, 50% of the existing cropland was formerly, or probably formerly, wetland. Other impacts that have eliminated wetlands and changed them in dramatic ways include things like dam construction. Dam construction, of course, inundates wetlands, changes their character dramatically, usually because the water that's impounded by the dam is not operated in a natural way. Rather, it's operated in a non-natural way. And when you have that kind of a situation, plants often aren't able to adapt to that non-natural way of managing the water. Other examples of dramatic wetland loss would point to San Francisco. For example, the San Francisco estuary prior to 1850 was huge. It was 1,400 square kilometers of freshwater wetlands and about 800 square kilometers of salt marsh. Today, about 125 square kilometers of undiked marshes exist. So prior to Eurasian settlement is on the left, and current wetland extent is on the right. So a 95% loss in the San Francisco estuary as a result of largely urban development, agricultural and industrial development. Nationally, it's estimated by authors that about 50% of the estimated 221 million acres of wetland that exist in the lower 48 states has been lost. In some areas, it's been almost completely, the wetlands have been completely lost. So Iowa, for example, the poster child for a loss of prairie as well as wetland habitat is very close to 100% wetlands lost there. And even though these wetland environments exist on just a very small percentage of our landscape, they have, as I mentioned previously, been targeted for alternative land uses, which has resulted in their loss. Now, you might be thinking that, well, gosh, with all the current regulation, perhaps this loss of wetlands has been stopped. Well, in fact, we have continuing wetland loss in this country. Nobody quite knows exactly how many acres are lost annually in this nation, but it's estimated between 700 to 2,000 acres of wetland are permanently lost to a variety of activities, mostly human activities. And at one point, the US government was very active in promoting the conversion of wetlands to agricultural and industrial use through a variety of statutes that they passed, including things like the Swamplands Act, the Donation Land Act, and the railroad land grants that Abraham Lincoln authorized. In Washington, if we look specifically at our state, we're sort of in the ballpark along with the rest of the nation. Estimates of pre-settlement wetland acreage in Washington range from about 1.1 to 1.5 million acres. Again, depending on who you read, it's estimated that between 20 to 50% of Washington's wetlands have been lost during the past 2 centuries. And in urbanized areas, that loss is nearly complete. For example, the city of Seattle. In Puget Sound, it's estimated that 70% of marshlands, freshwater wetlands, have been lost. In Willapa Bay, it's estimated that there's been a 50% loss of wetlands in that important estuary. The principal historical causes of loss and degradation would be ag development, siting of ports and industrial facilities, and dam construction. And then, unfortunately, most remaining wetlands have been significantly degraded. And the principal causes of continuing loss and degradation include urban development, forestry, ag development, and now, importantly, invasive species. Some great examples from Seattle, and I can criticize the city of Seattle because I work for the city and live here. Some great examples of wetland loss would include Smith Cove. Most people don't even realize that Smith Cove existed prior to Eurasian settlement of this city location, but it did. It was an estuary. It was about 150 acres of mudflat and estuarine vegetation. By about 1940, it was essentially completely filled for industrial purposes. It's now referred to as Inner Bay. And so on the right there, you see in 2013 what it looks like. Literally, there's only 1,200 square feet of the original Smith Cove wetland complex that exists. It's owned by Seattle Public Utilities, the department of the city of Seattle that I work for, and it's used primarily for draining stormwater from surrounding industrial development. Here it is delineated in this landscape on Seattle Public Utilities parcel. So 150 acres down to 1,200 square feet. That's a pretty successful elimination of a very interesting and important wetland in the Seattle area. Another great example, of course, is the Duwamish River estuary. Was about 1,400 acres in size, now basically eliminated. Less than 1% of the original landscape of the Duwamish estuary exists today, primarily on an island that hasn't been developed called Kellogg Island. And then we can always go outside of Seattle for some great examples. I like to use Factoria. Most people are familiar with this, where 405 and 90, those interstates junction. And that junction, prior to the construction of interstates, was primarily wetland, as illustrated on the left. If you know how to read aerial photos, you can tell that most of the landscape east and southeast of that intersection was wetland. And now it is essentially completely filled for urban uses. I have a friend who grew up in the Factoria area before it was developed and before the interstates were constructed. And he mentions to me just how abundant this particular native plant was in these wetlands. It's called California false hellebore, or Atrum californicum. And he said it was just all over these wetlands. And he spent a lot of time, he's a botanist, he spent a lot of time as a youth exploring these places. And now, this species is nowhere to be found. The nearest place to find it is actually in Falls City to the east, some 10 or 15 miles. So people's concept of wetlands and their feelings about them began to change sort of largely in the 1960s. And then, in fact, wetland science began to emerge as a subdiscipline of ecology at that time. This was a time when conservation groups were becoming concerned over wetland loss. The public even began to appreciate and value the unique ecological and societal functions that wetlands provide. And increasingly, there was interest from the governments at all levels, from the federal, state, as well as local governments, interest in stopping the loss of wetlands through regulation and policy. And so this whole focus on wetlands began to really intensify in the late 60s and then into the 70s, sort of first manifesting in the passage of the Clean Water Act in 1972. I mentioned that act was really the first time that a definition of wetlands was codified for regulatory purposes. Prior to that, there had been a lot of other definitions. For example, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service used their definition, not in a regulatory way, but to support their work. The U.S. National Academy of Sciences had their own definition. When I worked for King County, starting in the mid 80s, well, not for King County, but working in wetland science in King County, I was using 3 different definitions of wetlands at that time. One for the county, one from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and then also now the Corps of Engineers at that time. Finally, people began to align on the definition, and since about the mid to late 80s, folks have relied on the definition provided in the Clean Water Act. This definition, which I read to you at the start of my talk. So water, vegetation, and soil, all 3 criteria need to be present for an area to be identified as a wetland. And there's a methodology that sort of backs up how you conduct an evaluation of a space as to whether it is wetland or not. So first off, as you might intuit, wetlands need to have water. So wetlands that are inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater, and that water needs to be present for a specific period of time, as outlined in the methodology for identifying wetlands. That water can be salt water related, as you might find in an estuary. For example, the Palyx River estuary in Willapa Bay. That's a great shot of an estuarine system. It's influenced by brackish marine water. Those wetlands can be supported by riverine flows. Those are called riverine wetlands. Lower left there, Rock Creek, Escure Ranch in the channeled scablands of eastern Washington, south of Spokane. Or they can be associated with lakes. Those are called lacustrine systems. So the water that's in the lake can support wetlands. And then there are wetlands that are not associated with rivers or lakes in certain ways. And so those might be referred to differently. And so we refer to those as palustrine wetland systems. The second criterion is that those areas must support a prevalence of vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. So things like sluice sedge and sundew, a carnivorous plant, spend their entire lives in wetlands. They have special adaptations for that. You can find woody plants with special tricks up their sleeve to tolerate living in these areas where water is abundant. Black cottonwood, hardhack, for example, are 2 common examples of woody plants that are found there. Emergent plant species, things like yellow flag, which is a non-native invasive species in wetlands, introduced as a horticultural plant from Europe. Cattail, we have native as well as non-native species here. Both of those are well adapted for full-time living in wetland environments. You have floating leaved plants like spatterdock, which is native water lily relative, and then the invasive fragrant white water lily, again, highly adapted for life in water. And then you got free floating plants, things like water meal, which is the world's smallest flowering plant. You get an idea of the scale there. And then giant duckweed, a very interesting plant that floats on the water surface. So what's interesting about vegetation that occurs in wetlands is that they have these adaptations for living in a saturated, oxygen poor environment. And the flora that is found in wetlands often is unique. You don't find those species abundantly outside of wetland environments. Some species can tolerate both terrestrial or upland environments, but also live in wetland environments, things like black cottonwood or salmonberry, for example. And then the third and final criterion that comes into this definition of wetlands is that those areas must have saturated soil conditions. Now here's a complex topic. But let me just leave it at this statement that when a soil is saturated, when the oxygen is driven out by saturation and or inundation, the soil processes change dramatically. And those soil processes result in visible soil characteristics that you can use to identify wetland soils. So in this example from North Carolina, you have a soil series on the left, which is not found in wetland environments. It's never saturated. And then you have a soil series on the right, again from North Carolina, that is perpetually saturated. And you can see visually that there is an important difference between those two soil series. And so we use soil characteristics to assist us in identifying wetlands on the landscape. So again, the interesting thing about wetlands is this interaction between water, the plants and animals that live there, and the non-living environment, the soils and the chemical processes that happen there. It's this unique intersection of water, soil, vegetation, and terrestrial resources that make interesting science. And the types of waters that sustain wetlands also varies. I mentioned that there can be marine waters that are involved. That has important ramifications on who lives there and what soils look like. Not all wetlands perform all possible functions, nor do wetlands perform functions equally well based on this interaction. So this leads us then to a discussion of wetland functions, which is related to this question: how do wetlands work on the landscape? What do they do? Why is that important to us? Generally, we can categorize how wetlands work in three different ways. We can sort of answer that question in three different ways. We can look at physical or hydrological information, things like buffering shorelines from wave action or erosion, live and dead storage for stormwater and floodwater, recharge, discharge of groundwater. Wetlands also have important chemical and water quality functions. They capture sediment, they filter water, they transform pollutants, they treat non-point source runoff. They also have important biological functions, so nesting, spawning, rearing, and resting sites for aquatic and land species, food chain production, and so forth. So physical, chemical, and biological processes are the three baskets that we use to describe how wetlands work. But then there's something else. There's this overlay on top of functions, and that overlay asks the question, why are wetlands important to humans? And wetlands are important to humans for lots of different reasons, reflecting the diversity of human interests. For example, we're interested in wetlands because they reduce flood damage. We're interested in wetlands because we like to hike or fish or hunt or bird watch or boat in wetlands. There might be cultural significance that is important to us. And so there's this concept of wetland values that must be brought in to a discussion of wetland functions. Are you interested in wetlands in providing priority habitat for endangered species? Or are you interested in wetlands providing, say, access for industrial purposes? So a function is a physical, chemical, or biological process that takes place or occurs in an ecosystem. It's an ecological concept. It's a natural process that continues regardless of its perceived value to humans. And then you have the value overlaid on top of that. And that's the importance attached to a function by humans, a social construct. They might be directly function-based. For example, we like flood control functions that wetlands provide. Of course, the value might be very different among stakeholders and from region to region. And obviously, human values change over time as society's perceptions, needs, and priorities change. We combine function and value into a term which you no doubt have heard called ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are nothing more than that discussion of functions and their values to humans. So we can then translate those functions into ecosystem services. And a great example of that would be physical hydrological services. So flood control, shoreline protection. If you have shoreline property, that's an important aspect of wetland functioning. Groundwater recharge, which supports stream-based flow, which provides habitat for fish. Sediment management, all that stuff is good for humans. And so we can do the same for chemical water quality services, biological services. And then I'm going to throw in another category, a fourth category, which I refer to as socioeconomic services. And these are services related to human habitation. People actually live in wetlands, like the Cajuns. We get food from wetlands. We derive benefit from the bird and animal populations that live there. Some people use wetlands to harvest fuel, timber, and fiber. We recreate. We use wetlands for aesthetic and educational purposes, and wetlands are important for cultural and archaeological resources. Threatened and endangered species is a great example of ecosystem services that wetlands provide. It's estimated that 50% of the 209 animals federally listed as threatened or endangered occur in wetlands. Wetlands are among the most important to threatened and endangered species during some point in their life cycle, including 68% of birds, 63% reptiles, and so forth. Around here, we have many species that are rare, that rely on wetlands. And I was in a live lecture with you. I would quiz you on what animals those might be, but we could easily refer to fish, of course, things like Chinook salmon, bull trout, which are listed under the Endangered Species Act, the macaw copper, native butterfly, known from just a few wetland locations on the Olympic Peninsula, coastal plain, marbled murrelet, the western toad, of course, requires aquatic environments and wetlands. And then Beller's ground beetle, a very rare beetle found in just a handful of places in BC and Washington, and is an invertebrate that spends its entire life in bogs and fens. Then there's these really interesting cultural and archaeological services that wetlands provide. You know, the wetlands and floodplains bury, store, and preserve pollen, fossils, phytoliths, human artifacts, and even humans. So you probably have seen things like Tolland Man and Clonycavan Man, human bodies that have been preserved in peat bogs and such in Europe. These wetlands that basically bury, store, and preserve these artifacts have been used to gather really interesting and sometimes critical information for understanding how people lived prior to historical records. They've created paleoclimate records from this information. We understand the evolution of organisms and the social context of both human and other organisms just through the study of artifacts that are contained in wetlands. Wetlands have been important for subsistence around the world. Even here in the Pacific Northwest, Native Americans relied on wetlands to obtain certain plants and animals that they relied on. So for example, here in the upper left, this is a bog cranberry. Native peoples harvested things like sedge to make various tools and clothing, and they would eat things like bracken that would be found in these wetland environments. And then of course we educate ourselves and we recreate in wetlands. And these are just really excellent places for teaching folks about why wetlands are important, what wetlands do, and all the various adaptations that animals and plants have for living in those wet and oxygen poor environments. And then aesthetic services. We often give short shrift to things like aesthetic services, but art is an expression of nature in wetlands. Things like duck stamps have been an important contribution to our artistic sensibilities here in the US of A. Beauty of plants and animals is an important non-consumptive use of wetlands. A lot of people derive spiritual enrichment and so forth. Now, just tons of people birdwatch, canoe, provide themselves with solitude and wildness. Just the bird watching aspect of wetlands is an important economic resource for many communities. Bird watchers and hunters, fishers spend a lot of money on gear and tourism related expenses as they pursue their favorite sports. But wetlands continue to be lost and degraded, and the major causes of that would include things like biological alterations, which includes invasive species and climate change, chemical alterations, including pollutants, sediments, and nutrients, physical destruction or degradation. As I mentioned before, wetlands continue to be filled, drained, converted to other land uses. We now have, though, a host of federal, state, and local regulations that basically regulate how wetlands are managed and what activities can happen in those environments. In this list of federal statutes, the Clean Water Act and the Rivers and Harbors Act are the two critical federal statutes. At the state level, we have the Shoreline Management Act, which regulates activity in shoreline areas of the state, and also the Hydraulic Code. And then local governments, county and city governments, have critical area provisions, which also strongly regulate what happens to wetlands in those jurisdictions. Wherever you're looking at the state, federal, or local levels, we have this idea of jurisdictionality. It's that area regulated by a regulatory agency under a specific statute or statutes. And as I mentioned earlier, often wetland science practitioners are called in to identify that resource on the landscape, literally delineating it in the field. Here, this example from the Watershed Company, an environmental consulting firm, shows that in this landscape, there's a wetland located here. And so this becomes critical information at the regulatory level. As I mentioned, the Clean Water Act is an important regulatory statute at the federal level. So wetlands are included, bottom of the list, but they're still included as regulated waters of the United States. Basically all discharges of dredged or fill material, that includes temporary or permanent discharges, are regulated under the Clean Water Act. And as I mentioned, also there's a methodology that's used to identify those regulated resources. And almost everybody now uses these two federal manuals, the Corps of Engineers Wetland Delineation Manual and their regional supplement to that manual. If you look at these, you'll find that they're very technical. They describe how you identify wetland hydrology, wetland vegetation, and wetland soils. And that's what wetland science practitioners use in the field when they're hired to delineate and identify wetlands on a property for regulatory purposes. So what can you do as a landowner here in the US of A? We need to keep in mind that nearly 75% of all wetlands are privately owned, and we need to encourage folks to be good wetland managers and stewards. That means exploring, conserving, and restoring wetlands, opportunities to do that, supporting local wetland and watershed protection initiatives by donating materials, your time, or your money. Protect the function and values of wetlands in your home watersheds. Getting to know your home watersheds is an important first step in supporting wetland conservation and protection. Work with your local municipalities and state to develop laws and ordinances that protect and restore wetlands. Participate in the Clean Water Act Section 404 program and state regulatory programs by reviewing public notices, commenting on applications. So you can sign up to receive notices of permits that are being issued to applicants, and you can comment on those. And those citizen comments sometimes can have important implications in the nature of those permits that are being issued. Avoid wetland alteration and degradation during project construction. Comply with regulations. And maintain wetlands and adjacent buffers as open space. And also remember that your use of fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides have important impacts potentially on watercourses and those associated wetlands. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and that's who I am. And you're certainly welcome to reach out to contact me if you'd like further discussion, or if you have questions you'd like to run by me. And at this point, I think I'll turn it back to Grace and see if we have any questions from participants.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was awesome. Okay, we do have a few questions, and for participants, right now is a great time to pop your questions into the chat box if you've been holding on to them. Okay, first one. Awesome western red cedar and hemlock bog. Is this the natural habitat of these coupled trees?
Yeah, so, western red cedar and hemlock are not actually loyal to wetland environments. So you find them in upland environments abundantly in Washington. But these are two species that don't mind being in a wetland environment, and they particularly are able to survive. They don't prefer living there, but they they have adaptations that allow them to survive in bogs and fens. So I would say when you encounter a bog and fen that's forested, almost always it's going to be hemlock first, cedar second, or a mix of those two, and then frequently, depending on where you are, there will be Sitka spruce. Those three species have abilities to tolerate living in the difficult wetland conditions of bogs and fens. You'll rarely find Douglas fir in bogs or fens. They just do not have the ability to live well in those places. Good question.
Great. Okay, I have two related questions. The first part is, I have a wetland in winter in my forest. Any ideas of how to take care of it besides not cutting trees near it? And Ken says, to echo Amy, any suggestions for enabling or protecting vernal pools in forest systems?
We're talking, I saw you sort of cut in and out there, Grace. So you're talking about how to locate vernal pools?
How to protect and enable vernal pools.
Yeah, so
right now?
you're sort of cutting in and out. So this is in the chat, the question?
Yeah, sorry. Let me try to switch my audio.
So I can speak briefly about vernal pools. So vernal pools are highly specialized wetland types, and they're found in very specific places on the landscape. Around Puget Sound, we tend not to find what's called a vernal pool, technically a vernal pool. To find vernal pools, you need to really go to places like Eastern Washington, the channeled scablands. These are places that have a layer that is fairly shallow in the soil or geology that basically perches water shallowly at the beginning of the growing season. And then that water, as the growing season progresses, warms up and plants develop, that water basically begins to leave that system as it's evaporated and evapotranspired away. And then by the end of the season, that location is like completely dry. So those unique places are found in just very specific locations in this state. You find them abundantly in Eastern Washington, as I mentioned. There are places in Oregon, the southern Willamette Valley, for example, that have great examples of vernal pools. And then in California, there are places there that also have really excellent vernal pools. Because these are so specialized, often the flora and fauna that live in those vernal pools is unique to vernal pool systems. You just don't find them like anywhere else. A great example would be fairy shrimp. There are species of fairy shrimp that are found only in vernal pool habitats in Oregon and California. And some of those are actually endangered species protected under federal and state laws.
Great. Thank you so much. Can
Yeah.
you hear me right now?
Yeah, you're good now.
Okay, awesome. Let's see. Next question. We have a creek and wetland area that runs through our property and would love to develop it to be more, let me scroll down, come on. Oops, sorry, I lost it. Sustainable. What plans or interventions would you recommend to support it to thrive?
Yeah, so if it's an area that's been degraded, say by previous removal of vegetation, or perhaps ditching or tiling, or perhaps installing culverts and that kind of thing, one of the first things you should consider is restoring hydrology. So that might entail filling ditches or relocating or removing culverts. So an attempt to restore hydrology is one of the sometimes the easiest thing that you can do to get a wetland back on a restoration track. As what if you have water, you generally have the plants and animals and the soil conditions following that. Otherwise, if managing hydrology is more challenging, certainly revegetation is a great option, and a lot of folks do that. They plant trees. They manage invasive species and convert those invasive species areas to native vegetation. That's an easy thing to do, generally speaking. The thing to keep in mind about doing restoration, in a situation like this is that you probably will require permits to, for example, fool around with culverts or fill ditches, and sometimes even to kill invasive species. Making herbicide applications, for example, may require a certified pesticide licensed applicator and a permit. So the thing to do is come up with a plan and then inquire about what that plan might mean for your need to obtain permits to do that restoration. But thanks for that question. That was a good one.
Yeah, great. Thank you. All right, next question. I have significant wetlands with good protection buffers. Are there any good/standard ways to monitor the wetlands for continued health, or ideas where I could look to find such monitoring systems?
Yeah, that's a timely question. The Natural Heritage Program, which is a program of the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, has recently developed a methodology that allows pretty much anyone, without a technical background, to go to an area and evaluate that area for ecological integrity. And if you deploy that method over time, it then becomes like a series of snapshots, and you can evaluate whether that environment is degrading or improving in time. And particularly if you have like interventions in those systems. So I would actually direct you to the Washington State Natural Heritage Program. And there's a gentleman there who is in charge of that program called Joe Rocchio. That's Rocchio. And he can lead you to their website that has the manual for doing that ecological integrity assessment. So if you refer to that assessment methodology as ecological integrity, that'll get you to a very interesting place and a very useful technique for doing just what you'd like to do, monitoring systems over a long period of time.